Welcome to the Growing in Grace podcast, where you can listen in on some casual conversation about the good news of Jesus without all of the inconsistent religious double talk. If you've ever struggled with feelings of hopelessness, guilt, and despair, or wondered if you're really right with God, it's time to discover the true freedom that comes with the gospel of unlimited and overflowing grace.
17th anniversary program, take one.
Here we go.
There, Mike Kapler with Joel Brueseke. Joel, can you believe it's been 17 years? We've been doing this weekly podcast of growing in God's grace.
One more year and we're an adult.
Yes. We can start eating solid food.
Yeah, really. We can vote as a podcast.
Are you able to do that now, by the way? I meant to ask you before we came on.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I was sick for a week or so, and I am doing much better. Although I started a new job, and I went from being sedentary for about 8 days, and then I started a job where I do about 17,000 steps a day. and I push and pull large carts throughout part of the day. So yeah, it's taken me some time to get used to that, but my body is worn right now. But anyway, yeah, doing well. But yeah, 17 years. I mean, we've always said this. I mean, I've always said it. Like, who would have thought that we would have gone from where we were 17 years ago on the Growing in Grace podcast to doing this thing for 17 years. And I've shared this many times. I'm not a talkative person. I fool a lot of people with this podcast because when we get going here, I really do like to talk about this stuff. But I'm really not what a person would consider a conversationalist. I'm not really, not that I don't like people. I'm not antisocial. I'm a pretty quiet person. Don't necessarily like talking. And here I ended up in radio for 11 and a half years, being on the radio, working with you, of course. That started way back in the 90s. And then that led to you and me meeting each other and talking about all this grace stuff. You shared some things with me. And then we've done this podcast now for 17 years. And it's just the work of God that's the only way that I can really describe it. Because the way that God works, there's that saying, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. It's like, I'm not qualified to do this. When I survey my own life, when I think about who I am, my likes and dislikes, how I'm built, I'm not a talker, like I said. This isn't me, so to speak, but it's Christ in me. It's God in me who is doing this thing. And so that is how this thing has been sustained for 17 years, along with you and God working in your life too, Cap. And I know your story and how we merged together. We can maybe share some of that. I don't know. We don't really have a format for today. We're just reminiscing, talking about the 17 years history of this podcast. And I don't know. We'll see what ends up coming out of our mouth.
Yeah, we were talking about how when we started this thing, it's not like we had an outline or, a detailed plan, a business plan or any of that. It was just somebody asked us if we would do something and we just kind of did it. And when you look back on things like that, not that there's anything wrong with planning.
Right.
We could have had this program more scripted, more prepared instead of spontaneous and just talking off the cuff. But this is just the way it developed and evolved. And so there's a variety of different ways that people can do things. I mean, maybe we would be more effective communicators if we had everything written out, because Joel and I, we both kind of like to write things sometimes. It gives you a chance to gather your thoughts and say things the way you want to say them. But there's also something to be said about just talking from the heart, back and forth, the way that we do. It's kind of just a cool thing to do, to be real, to be authentic. So there's a different ways to approach different things. But you can look back on it, Joel, and realize, and I'll bet a lot of our listeners could testify to this, that you've done some things, and you look back on it later and you realize that the hand of God orchestrating certain things in a way that you may not have even realized it at the time. I mean, even when we came up with the name for the program, I can remember exactly, I think, where I was sitting in my little radio office. You were at home at the time, and we were talking on the phone. as we were getting ready to maybe try to do this, which neither one of us was probably all that comfortable with. We probably felt terribly underqualified and maybe a little nervous about the unknown of doing what we now call a podcast. But even coming up with the title, I think it just all happened so fast. And growing in grace, I think I just threw out to you, hey, Peter said this, growing in the grace and the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. What do you think about naming the program this? And then Joel got together on his techie side of things. The internet was still, something we were learning more about back at that time. It had been around for a little while, but Joel just kind of splashed in there and started doing things to get stuff ready for getting it on the web, coming up with a logo for the Growing in Grace title name. I mean, this was never meant to be a donation-based ministry or any kind of a money-making ministry. We just did it out of the goodness of our hearts to share the excitement of what we had individually and collectively experienced about God's grace, which was so very different than many of the things we had learned through religious circles.
Yeah, I mean, it was so, it was so, I don't know the word spontaneous, so, not planned. It was something that we just wouldn't have come up with ourselves. It was just a God thing. And, the whole, like the title. And I remember even after we had been doing this thing for a while, I found out that there was a book by Bob George. Some of our listeners will be familiar with Bob George. He had written a book called Growing in Grace. We had never heard of that book. So I was worried that people would think that we were copying that title, but really it was like you said, it was just something we came up with on the phone. You mentioned that.
Well, and back then, Joel, I had never even heard of Bob George.
Yeah,
of course, I have now, but back then I hadn't.
Yeah, I don't think I had
we had not been exposed to a whole lot of grace teaching out there.
Yeah, and so that's another thing, is that we were very limited in what we had been exposed to. There weren't a whole lot of, quote, grace teachers out there like there are now. There's tons of them, and it's great. I mean, it's pretty cool. You can go on the internet and Facebook and Twitter and all these places. You can find great, stuff, some great pages on Facebook that you'll be able to be exposed to a lot of this stuff. But we had virtually nothing other than we had been part of a small church in our hometown here in Waterloo, Iowa. We'd been part of that church where the pastor had, in the late 90s, mid-90s or so, actually, I guess, had changed what he was teaching. He had come across the grace message, and he was teaching that for an hour every Sunday. We were both, well, you at first it was you who was there, and then you started sharing that stuff with me when we were at the radio station together. That's how I got connected to it all, and then things kind of took off from there for you and me. And for you and me, it was more of a thing that for about 10 years, about a decade, from the mid-'90s to around 2005, which was when this program started, it was just you and me talking things out together. I would go on the internet and share some things in Christian chat rooms, usually opposed by people. But then finally, I found a Grace forum that I was able to share some things on, and that's how somebody said, hey, would you like to do this program on a Grace radio station? And then I didn't want to do it by myself, so that's why I said, hey, what about you? Would you like to do this with me? That's how this started. Again, it was just nothing planned, nothing that we would have come up with ourselves. Then here we are 17 years later this week. The Growing in Grace, what's now is known as a podcast, has been going. And I just think that it's really neat how over the years we've talked about so many different things, but all related basically to the same core message of God's love and grace. And that's really what it's centered about. And wanting to help people to understand it. We know how it has affected our lives. Again, compared to the religion, the legalism that we were both in, you and I both to different extents, but compared to all that, we found the freedom, we found the love of God, we found stability in His grace and in His steadfastness, rather than us trying to eke out this life of performance for God, knowing that it's all based upon Him. And we've been freed up by this, and so we want to share that freedom with other people. And we've heard from many people over the last 17 years, and that's been exciting too, just to know that there are other people out there who have been touched And again, we don't pat ourselves on the back for this because, again, it's a God thing. The whole thing here is a God thing. And so any person's life that has been touched through this podcast has been because of what God has done in and through us, reaching out to other people through us. That's how I see it. And as long as this podcast goes, I mean, I think it's just going to be the same.
Speaking of hearing from people, this was somebody recently by the name of Stephanie, and she wrote to us and kind of shared her story, ended up later writing a bit of a blog, a review of Clash of the Covenants, and really telling her story in that review in great detail. So she writes to us initially, though, and kind of shares some things about how she had fallen into religious bondage through churchianity and that sort of thing. But she gets to the place where she says, somewhere in there, I discovered your podcast, Growing in Grace. Months later, you mentioned you'd written a book. I am now in the third section of it and have already bought 3 more copies to give away. She says, the book doesn't feel like, oh, that's a cool perspective. She says it feels like truth, as if the Holy Spirit himself gave you that insight and you took the time to share it with us. So she went on to say, thank you. I've been listening to all 800 plus episodes of the Growing in Grace podcast. Sometimes I'll go for long walks and just let it run. And so, again, things like that. I've got another one here too, Joel, that I had received some correspondence from a pastor out east in the United States who had mentioned that he had a leadership academy coming up, and he was familiar with the podcast, and he became familiar with Clash of the Covenants, the book, and he started asking if he could use the book as what they would be going through in their conference, and even wondered if I would come out there, which I did not do. But I remember responding back to him recently, wondering how things came out with that, because I think it was last fall. And he wrote back and said, our people absolutely love the book. And the book is really it was birthed from the podcast. That's why I mentioned this. But he said, our people absolutely love it. We had about 75 people go through it. We keep copies in our bookstore, and it sells out monthly. We're going to a 200 level class, as well as the 100, and the Covenants book will be the curriculum going forward for every semester. So there's people out there trying to figure out God. And that's an eternal process. We're just here, as Joel said, to try to help people begin to understand some of the basics of the finished work of Jesus Christ. And it's so very different from what most of us have been taught. And I know people mean well, and we're not trying to be just critical when I know sometimes it sounds like we're coming down on the church, and we don't really mean to do that. It might come across that way, and if so, we apologize in advance and hereafter.
Yeah.
But it gets a little frustrating, doesn't it? When people are being told things that really are very distant from the truth.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we've talked about before. I think we even did a podcast on it. Is sometimes how to come up with a grace podcast or something like that. And it's like, just listen to what's going on in the church today. There's all kinds of material, quote material, that you can get just by listening to the religious stuff that's out there, and then just wanting to share the truth about that. That's not really how we go about this. It was kind of a funny thing that we did, and I think that you can listen to what's going on in church. You emails like what you've read, and emails that we've come across where people have sent us their story of how religion has burned them, and that inspires us too to keep on sharing the truth of God's grace. Cap, you want to do this for another week? I know we had. You might be noticing that up till now, for 17 years, we have pretty much stuck with 14 minutes per podcast. Every once in a while, we might have gone a little bit longer, 14 and a half or 15 minutes. We have decided to break the exactly 14-minute rule. See, what happened was, at first, like I said, we were on an actual online radio station. It needed to be an exact amount of time every week. And then as time went on, some people added us to their own online thing. So we kept it at an exact amount. And that's no longer the case. We still want to keep it, we don't want it to be too long every week, but we've decided that we don't have to stick to that exact 14-minute thing. So, but I still have some more things I think that it'd be fun to share. So maybe let's let's wrap this one up and
not to make anybody panic. It's not like we're going to go for a half hour.
Right.
It'll still be in the 15-minute range.
Right.
Who knows, Joel? Maybe we'll have a Forrest Gump moment, and we'll only go 12 because that's all we'll have to say about that.
That's all I have to say about that. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get, but hopefully you'll continue to see the consistency of the grace message, the love and grace of God here on the Growing in Grace podcast. So let's share a little bit more next week about our 17 years on Growing in Grace.
This has been Growing in Grace with Mike Kapler and Joel Brueseke, heard online through various internet sources around the world each week. Access past programs by visiting growingingrace.org. Share it with a friend and listen again next week for more Growing in Grace.